It's hard to be a reader in 2024. Before getting into a good book, you have to somehow ignore your inbox, avoid doom scrolling, break free from the algorithm, and then just when you're getting into it, there's an alert that pulls you back out. That's why reading technology company Soul designed the Soul Reader, a wearable e-reader that helps you shut out the world and get back to reading. You put on the Soul Reader like a pair of glasses. Just slip it on, lay back, and see the pages of a book right there in front of you on an e-ink screen. Think of it as noise canceling for your eyes. No distractions, just words. Check out the Soul Reader at soulreader.com, solreader.com, to start reading without distraction. And if you use the code COVERS15 at checkout, you'll receive 15% off your purchase of Soul Reader Limited Edition. Today's episode is also brought to you by The World with Its Mouth Open, an original and powerful debut collection by Zahid Rafiq called Restrained and Revelatory by Omar El-Akkad and tenderly and exquisitely rendered by Sinja Banu. The 11 stories in The World with Its Mouth Open follow the inner lives of people in Kashmir as they journey through an uncertain terrain of their day-to-day lives, fractured from years of war. From an expectant mother walking on a precarious road to two dogs wandering the city, the stories in The World with Its Mouth Open are a testament to the life, beauty, and humor that offer refuge in the face of devastation. Elena Maria Viramontes praises, "Reading each story, my heart pumps and I recognize myself." The World with Its Mouth Open is available now from Tin House. At the beginning of the year, the most improbable thematic connection emerged across multiple episodes. A connection that was not at all by design, but one that has never appeared otherwise. That of cannibalism, where first, when talking to Mattia Senar about his book, The Annual Banquet of the Gravediggers Guild, we touched upon a character in another of his books who was studying the corpse wine drinkers of Borneo, and both how the corpse wine was used and what it signified. This was soon followed by Alvaro Enrique, where in his imagining into the many undocumented days Hernan Cortés spent as a guest in Montezuma's palace in his novel We Dreamed of Empires, we revisited the question of ritual cannibalism among the Aztec peoples, the way the accusation of it was weaponized, and also the way Montaigne in France recontextualized this cannibalism to opposite ends. And then when talking to Anne DeMarkin about her book, It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over, winner of the 2024 Ursula K. Le Guin Prize in Fiction, we talk even more about cannibalism, both in the realm of her zombie protagonist and also in the real world of the United States. I bring this up because I wonder if we are in the beginnings of another trend, not one quite as improbable for sure, but today's conversation with Rodrigo Fresán does not revisit cannibalism, even if his book about Herman Melville's father does actually have a vampire character within it. But the focus on Melville in today's conversation comes right after my conversation last month with Dion Brand, where we talk favorably about Melville's story Benito Sereno in relation to the portrayal of Black life on the page. That isn't much of a trend, I admit, even if we reach back to the conversation with Cecilia Vicuña, where we explore the fantastical seeming yet true relationship between deer and whales, a prehistoric deer being the evolutionary link between the whale's land-based ancestors and the whales we know today. But perhaps what makes this wisp of a trend leap out is actually how strange it is that Melville doesn't come up much more often on the show. There certainly is no better conversation than today's to remedy this in a deep way. and also in many surprising ways. It's a conversation that is both deeply about Melville and deeply at the very same time, sometimes in the very same moments, about Argentinian literature. I should also mention that from long ago in the bonus audio archive is this really incredible reading by Christine Scutt of Elizabeth Hardwick's writings on Moby Dick. If you subscribe to the bonus audio and you missed it, it is definitely worth seeking out. And one of the great treats for me to share today with bonus audio archive subscribers is the long-form conversation with Rodrigo's translator, Will Vanderheiden. It's a treat for me because Will and I have been talking on and off for years and anticipating the possibility of talking together for literally years. And given the unusually close relationship that Will and Rodrigo have with each other and how formative Will's encounter with Rodrigo's work was to his life trajectory as a translator, it's an incredible complement to today's conversation with Rodrigo. It also joins many long-form translator conversations in the bonus archive. Thinking of just the Spanish language translators alone, it includes Megan McDowell about translating Mariana Enriquez, and another time about translating Alejandro Zambra. It includes Sarah Booker and Suzanne Jill Levine, both about translating different books by Cristina Rivera Garza. It includes Sophie Hughes about Fernanda Melchor, Michelle Gil Montero about Valerie Mayer Caso, and many others. And the bonus audio is only one of many possible things to choose from the Tin House Early Reader subscription to rare collectibles from past guests. But regardless of what you choose, every supporter is invited to join our collective brainstorm of who to invite on the show going forward, something that significantly influences the future of the show. And every listener supporter gets resources with every episode of what I discovered in preparing, what we discussed during the conversation, and where to explore once you're done listening. You can check it all out at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's conversation with Rodrigo Fresán. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is Argentinian writer and critic Rodrigo Fresán. Born in Argentina and spending his adolescence in Venezuela, Fresán has called Barcelona home since the late 1990s. His debut book, Historia Argentina, was one of the first books of his generation to deal with the years of the dictatorship in Argentina using dark humor, irony, and sarcasm. And this book, by an as-of-yet unknown author, immediately upon its release, was #1 on the bestseller list. Spanish critic Ignacio Echevarria called it a manual of instructions from which to devise the pattern of a mutant literature, and a book that contains the germ of all of Fresán's subsequent books. Historia Argentina and the 5 books that follow it in the subsequent decade have not yet been translated into English. His 2003 novel Kensington Gardens was the first of his books to be translated, a translation by Natasha Wimmer. And everything since then has been translated by Will Vanderheiden for Open Letter Books. The Bottom of the Sky, an homage to the history of American science fiction, described as a Kurt Vonnegut novel told by David Lynch through the lens of Philip K. Dick. And also, to borrow his translator's description, his nearly 2,000-page three-headed monster and masterwork, the trilogy the invented part, the dreamed part, and the remembered part. The invented part, winner of the 2018 Best Translated Book Award, was described in Kirkus's starred review as follows: a tour de force from Argentinian writer Fresán, charting a course from confusion to confusion and back again. Think of it as a portrait of the artist as a young cultural omnivore grown old, under whose lens Heraclitus, Einstein, and Looney Tunes all have more or less equal footing. An exemplary postmodern novel that is both literature and entertainment. In 2017, Fresán won the Prix Roger Caillois for his body of work, joining past winners Edouard Glissant, César Aira, and Carlos Fuentes, to name a few. Beyond the writing of novels and stories, Fresán worked as a journalist from a young age, writing about food, music, cinema, and literature. He has interviewed many writers from Martin Amis to Salman Rushdie. He has written the prologues to many American writers' works when translated into Spanish, from John Cheever to Carson McCullers, and he is the translator of the Spanish version of Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son. He was also, upon moving to Barcelona, the editor of the Roja y Negra series of crime novels published by Random House in Spain. Rodrigo Fresán is here today to talk about his latest book to be brought into English by Will Vanderheiden for Open Letter Books, his novel Melvill. Publishes Weekly in its starred review says, Argentine writer Fresán focuses his visionary latest on the inner life of author Herman Melville and the exploits of his tormented father, Alan. The review ends declaratively, "This is a masterpiece." And Kirkus in its starred review calls Melville an elegant, meditative story about storytelling. For lives are, Fresán writes, really books of stories. And finally, Pass Between the Covers guest Mariana Enriquez says, Melville is an invocation, a seance. The voices of father and son cross time to speak of failure and genius, of the mysteries of the whale and of the vampires in the night sky. Fresán conjures these airs of sadness and obsession with hypnotic writing of rare beauty. This novel is an invitation to walk on the ice. Welcome to Between the Covers, Rodrigo Fresán.
Hello, thanks for having me, and what a life.
It really is.
I don't know if to get excited or depressed about it.
So as a prelude to asking you about what captured your imagination about writing a novel that centers brief moments in the life of Herman Melville's father, I first wanted to ask you about Herman Melville himself. There are quite a few Spanish language authors who you have known or who you care about that themselves care about Melville. Borges has a poem entitled Herman Melville, and he called Moby Dick an infinite novel, a narrative that page by page expands and even exceeds the size of the cosmos. Enrique Villamatas, who engages deeply with Bartleby, also says about his own writing, quote, "It's as if my characters form part of the damned crew of the Pequod and continue to pursue Moby Dick in the 21st century." Bolaño, when asked by Mexican Playboy to pick the 5 books that most marked his life, said, quote, "In reality, the 5 books are more like 5,000. I'll mention these only as the tip of the spear. Don Quixote, Moby Dick, the complete works of Borges, Hopscotch, and A Confederacy of Dunces." And in his book, Entre Parentheses, he says of Melville and Twain, "All American novelists, including those who write in Spanish, at some point in their lives get a glimpse of 2 books on the horizon. There are 2 roads, 2 structures, and 2 arguments, sometimes 2 destinies. One is Moby Dick by Melville, the other is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain." So talk to us about what your relationship and your interest is in Melville, the writer? Why Melville?
Well, first of all, in the beginning, it's Moby Dick, then a bridge version for children or young readers, and it's just the part of the story going after a whale under the orders of a mad captain, and that's enough, really.
For sure, for a kid.
And then you grow up, and then books start to grow up also with you, and you read the complete version, and you discover that everything's there. Well, I think really that I have this theory about the roots of the great American novel, that sort of spectra always called. And I think that there are like 4 books, original books, that they work as the areas for successive variations through history and time. No? One of them is Moby Dick, that it's the multi-symbolic novel. Ahab can symbolize anything. The whale can symbolize anything. Queequeg can symbolize everything. Ishmael, the Pequod. I mean, it's like a multi-symbolic novels, and you can see all the novels that sort of sail after Moby Dick. The other one is The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, which is the novel of puritanical rights and sexual repression. The other one, of course, is like the road novel, the first person, very hysterical, that takes the reader by their lapels. It's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And the fourth one is the one of the writer that goes abroad and opens himself to the world and to the old world, and its portrait of a lady. And I think that in these 4 novels, you have the whole thing, the whole game of what the different models of great American novel. And there's a 5th one that for me, it's the real and more authentic American novel, that it's Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov.
Yeah.
Because I think there's nothing more American than a foreigner writing in English and sort of revitalizing the whole language and discovering the motels, lots of landscapes that were already there, but they weren't yet in fiction,
Huh. I love that.
Sorry, and to finish the thing, I think that the distinctive and sort of astonishing thing about Moby Dick is that it contains everything that went before Moby Dick in literature and sort of anticipates everything that will come after Moby Dick. There's a part in Melvill in the novel where an old Herman Melville goes into a tavern in the port of New York, and there are sailors there singing like sea chanties and ballads. And in fact, they're singing songs of the White Album by the Beatles, which I think it's the Moby Dick of pop music, because it does, well, it's completely white, the cover, as a whale, for starters. It's huge, it's big, it has multitude of styles and references and influences. And it also contains everything that came before and everything that will come later, like heavy rock, punk rock, indie rock, whatever you want to listen to.
That's amazing. Well, when I talked to Hernan Diaz for the show about his book, Trust, I read his earlier book on Borges as part of my preparation to talk to him. And it was a book that really opened my eyes to how much the literature of the United States influenced Borges. Diaz says it is hard to think of 2 writers that shaped Borges more than Edgar Allan Poe and Walt Whitman. And Borges himself says that all that is specifically modern in contemporary poetry comes from these, quote, 2 North Americans of genius. Then when I talked with Argentinian writer Mariana Enriquez, when she was on the show, we talked about how she felt that it wasn't just Borges, but that more broadly, the tradition of the fantastical in Argentina was usually not place-based, and that what appealed to her about North American horror and horror writers was that the horror came up from the ground, the particulars of the place, of the soil and the histories there, of what was buried there, and that she wanted to write an Argentinian horror like that, where the specifics of place are what produces the horror in the narrative. So thinking of your engagement with Melville, or in other books, the history of American science fiction, or your long-standing engagement with Bob Dylan, you yourself have said, I consider myself very Argentine in the sense that I don't consider myself Argentine at all. And, quote, I think that while other literatures from Latin America, and even from Spain, have their roots firmly in the ground where they take place, Argentine literature's roots are buried in the wall, and more concretely in the wall of the library. The tradition of the Argentine writer is built more on the foundation of the figure of the reader than the figure of the writer. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about this, both what it means to build a tradition on the figure of the reader, and also maybe if you have any theories why you think this tradition rose in Argentina of all places.
I don't think if it's only an Argentinian thing, but maybe it has to be with Argentina. And when I say Argentina, I say Buenos Aires and Montevideo in Uruguay, that sort of territory. It's pretty insular, and they always wanted to be, I think, not part of Latin America, but part of some sort of lost province of Europe and the United States, like some sort of Atlantis that it didn't sink, but it went far, far, far away, Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Borges, and Borges and all my favorite Argentinian writers, they're basically super readers. I mean, all their fiction or the literature, it's built around the idea of reading and writing, and all his fictions are filled up with writers and readers as main characters. And in fact, there's this essay by Borges that it's titled The Argentinian Writer and Tradition. I'm going to paraphrase, I don't remember the quote exactly, but at the end he says that it's a great commandment or a great suggestion or a great advice. He says something like, we have to resign ourselves to the fatality of being Argentinians, so we have the consolation that our whole theme is the whole universe, So you don't have to sort of base yourself in your territory. And if you do some sort of very, very superficial review, you'll find out that all great Argentinian novels are very strange formally, are fragmented, are sort of kaleidoscopic, are not exactly taking place in reality. Mm. And that's very different to the idea of the great Mexican novel or the great Colombian novel or the great Peruvian novel or the great Chilean novel, where they have some sort of, not a mandate, but some sort of duty to be witnesses to their time and their region. And we in Argentina, we always want to run away, we want to escape the place where we were born. In fact, I think that when you introduced me and said Argentinian writer, I'm 61 years old now, so I'm sort of starting to vislumbrate, the twilight horizon, and you discover that it's going to be much more important the place where you're going to die as a writer than the place where you were born. I mean, you have no decision in the place where you were born. It's some sort of chance of your parents meeting and your parents being born somewhere. But the place where you end up living and dying, I think, is much more important and much more formative. Mm. And you live in your library also. It's the real homeland for you. And so the things you read are inevitably going to influence the things you write. And I really like American literature and British literature. Mm. Like Borges.
Yeah. In the acknowledgments and endnotes of this book, Melville, you quote a line from another one of your books, from the book The Remembered Part. And that line goes, and yes, he'd once fantasized about writing a novella about Herman Melville's father, a beautiful loser walking across the frozen Hudson River to return to his family and die among them amid deliriums, and with his young son seeing it all and taking notes and thinking of the whiteness of the snow and the ice. And that is, in fact, a description of the book we are discussing prior to you having published it. So how and why did you end up fantasizing about Melville's father in this way? Not only a figure that no one thinks about, but also this very tiny slice of his life at the very end.
I really like the idea that it's very tiny. The original idea for the book, it was going to take place in just that night with Alan Melville crossing the frozen Hudson, And I sort of advanced it and put it in the remembered part. The main character of the remembered part, it's a writer that can't write anymore. So I was really worried about somebody stolen that idea from me, that someone was going to make the book about Alan Melville crossing the frozen Hudson. So it was a gift to my character who can write anymore. And at the same time, it was some sort of, okay, this is mine and maybe I'm going to do it, so don't touch it. I read the biography by Melville by Nicolas Del Banco, I think. And it sort of mentions here, it's 2-3 lines. Alan Melville, Herman Melville's father, died when Herman Melville was like 10, 11 years old. So he didn't take much space in the life of Melville, So that gave me a lot of territory in order to invent. There's some very interesting data in the huge 2-volume Herman Melville biography by Herschel Parker, where he sort of deals with the Albany, the immigration and the colonization of Albany and all the Dutch families going to Manhattan and building their businesses on the shores of the Hudson River, But it really, really intrigued me, that idea. In all my books, the father and son thing, it has like some relevance. Maybe that's the result of having listened a lot to Cat Stevens' Father and Son when I was a kid. I don't know. Or maybe having a sort of very complicated life with my parents who belong to a 60s utopical generation who were like bound to change everything. And in fact, it didn't work out that way,
No, indeed it did not.
No. Imagine there's no heaven,
Yeah.
It's not easy if you try.
Father and Son was a big part of my soundtrack when I was a little kid too.
Yeah.
So part 1 of this book is titled The Father of the Son and is written about the life of Herman Melville's father, Alan. But this section of the book is heavily footnoted. And it turns out that these footnotes in this section about the life of Alan are written by his son, Herman. So even in this 70-page section about the father, in many ways, the footnotes and the son's voice dominate from below. Obviously, Alan is a mere footnote in Herman Melville's life from our vantage point, a positionality you've reversed here. But your use of footnotes is not specific to this project. If we leap back 20 years to your English debut, Kensington Gardens, there is the line, "Children begin as footnotes to their parents, and parents end up being footnotes to their children." And that book, 2 decades ago, shares this interest in children and parents too. But even reading your essays, for instance, your essay in The Believer about your friendship with Bolaño, it too has many, sometimes quite voluminous footnotes. This element of your work that points us both to more information, but also points us to more information away from where our eyes are resting at the moment. It feels like one defining character of your writing. So I was hoping we could spend a moment talking about where this impulse comes from for you think, and to what end.
I didn't remember having written that on Kensington Gardens. I'm completely shocked about what I said in the light of what I did after with Melville. Well, the footnotes, it's not David Foster Wallace influence. It's Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire, I think. In Pale Fire, the footnotes are all at the end, are not technically rigorous footnotes because are not at the foot. But I think that's the idea of, someone like some sort of distorted witness commenting on what is supposedly the official story, but not so much in a way. I love footnotes.
Well, I could tell.
There are many people that really hates them. And when you have to compose, the book for printing, it's trouble, There's a huge footnote at the beginning of the third part of Melvill that I wanted to make it, the footnote growing and going into the main text.
Yeah, I love that moment when the footnote becomes the main text.
But my publishers hate it because it was very difficult to, sort of balance the footnote with the text. But I think it's worthwhile. I really like I love reading footnotes. And if you think, our whole lives, our whole reality is lived through footnotes. I mean, when you're talking to someone, you're always looking down and trying to, see the small print about what they're saying to you,
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest laughs I had was the page in that section that had only one sentence on it, surrounded by white space otherwise. So there's one sentence on a page that goes, "The son's name is Herman," and the footnote way at the bottom in small print is, "Call me Herman." You said in an interview about this book that beyond the Melvilliana, its themes are the same as all your recent writing, namely the themes being, in your words, reading and writing, the mysteries of the literary vocation, and parenthood. And thinking of that quote from 20 years ago in Kensington Gardens about children and parents in relation to footnotes, all the way through the most recent book, which is, again, a deep engagement with being a father and being a son, where not only is Herman as a child at his father's deathbed, but as an adult in this same book, he's haunted by the death of his two sons. You suggest Billy Budd is his fictionally recreated son, quote, innocent, angelic, beautiful, and condemned to die, summarily executed. And there's the question of legacy and what is inherited, particularly around his father's madness, which you describe as Alan subjecting his son to his white delirium. And Herman is later accused by his critics of his books, that they've been affected by an inherited madness from his father. And late in the book, there's this wonderful line, "It is not parents who write their children, but the children who rewrite their parents." I know you've already spoken to this preoccupation of father and son and parenthood, but does this spark any other further thoughts about this enduring interest, which goes decades across your career?
God, I don't think I want to think about it. I feel like I'm at the shrink now.
Do you want to lie down on the couch?
I'm Argentinian. My mother is a shrink, but I've never participated in that very Argentinian right that it's going to psychoanalyze us. But first of all, and in order to not answer your question, I want to say that very nice for me to hear quotes you're reading from Melvill are in fact quotes of a book that Will van der Heyden wrote. I mean, he's an amazing translator, and Chad Post and Kaija Sormanis are very daring publishers. And I want to say this, I'm really grateful from the bottom of my heart and brain to them. And I'm sort of trying to gain some time in order not to answer your question.
Well, let me ask you something that has nothing to do with the book, but I'm curious about is why is psychoanalysis so big in Argentina?
Who knows? Who knows? It's a mystery.
It is.
Yeah, Ingmar Bergman films were big before everywhere in the world. I mean, I don't know. I don't know why. Maybe Argentinians like a lot to talk about themselves, But I never understood, being a writer, when they ask me why I've never went to a shrink, being an Argentinian, I always answer the same. I'm a writer. I'm not going to pay for telling stories. You have to pay me.
You have to pay me. So you'd go to a psychoanalysis if you were paid.
I don't think so. No.
You wouldn't go there either.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Okay. No, what you said about the terms legacy and parents and father and son, and if you go to the beginning of times and to the first examples of what's considered literature or fiction, it's already there. Well, it's in the Bible, father and son,
Yeah, from the beginning.
Yeah. And you have all these Greek Roman gods, having sons and killing each other all the time and sort of plotting against each other,
Yeah. So the first section, the father of the son, ends with the father's death. And section 2, titled Glaciology, or the transparency of the ice. In that section, we're back with the living Herman Melville, the father. We're in the father's consciousness, but this time without any footnotes by his son. And it dilates this real moment in the father's life where he walks across the frozen Hudson River. And yet, even though it's dilating this real moment, it's the most fantastical portion of the book, and also the most, I think, philosophical and meditative. He uses science and the science of glaciers to give account of his nature with lines like, "Is ice the substance that the memory is made of? Or is memory something you envelop in ice to keep from losing it?" There's a long meditation on the various colors of ice, on whiteness for sure, but ultimately a long investigation of the color blue, as well as the ancient world's supposed color blindness to blue, one theory behind why Homer described the sea as wine dark. I love this long meditation on ice, partially because I think of this time period in human history, the 19th century, being one where the human fantastical imagination was projected onto ice more than anywhere else. We knew of the poles, but they had not yet been explored. They were unknown and unmapped, but our imagination lived there. Like, some people then thought that the Garden of Eden was there. And when you got close enough or far away enough from the equator, the migration of birds reversed and went polar, and the weather got warmer rather than colder. This isn't in your book, but this is in the milieu of respectable thought at the time. Others thought there were holes in the poles. So Jules Verne, his journey to the center of the earth, imagined we reach the center through these holes. Edgar Allan Poe's only novel, which follows a voyage to get to the pole, instead, almost there, encounters an island of the blackest of black people, so black they even have black teeth. And then ultimately, when they get as far as they can go, they encounter this immense, impossibly white creature, or phantom creature. But talk to us about how this section for you, this section most deeply in the consciousness of Herman Melville, becomes a chapter on glaciology and on ice. Is it because of these elements? Is it because of the time period, or is it something entirely different?
First of all, it's some sort of homage to the chapter in Moby Dick about the white and the whiteness. It starts like this. But there's also all you mentioned, especially Gordon Pym, and follow up that Lovecraft did, that it's at the Mountains of Madness, that sort of continues Gordon Pym. As we said or insinuated at the beginning, there's a really interesting thing about Argentinian literature that I'm sure it's the only one in Spanish, but I think it's in any language, in all languages in the world, and probably in the galaxy, that all their huge totemical, monolithical writers, they sort of practice that fantastic literature or fiction of the strange, which is not very common. I mean, for us Argentinian writers, when they talk about genres, this is fantasy or this is horror. For us, for all of us, it's just literature. I mean, we don't have that sort of compartments as firmly drawn as in other languages or in other countries. It's the most fantastical part, because there's also that grand tour story when Alan Melville goes to Europe that starts as the typical American on a grand tour in order to receive some education or an education, whatever you want, and then go back to the New World. But I always wanted to write since the beginning of times when I was just a reader who wanted to be a writer, and I'm talking 5 years old. I always wanted to write a vampire story, because Dracula was one of the huge books when I was growing up. And in fact, was the first not abridged edition of a book that I read. Was like 7-8 years old. And I felt like, okay, I'm reading now the real thing, not the sort of condensed, infantilized edition for kids. And I wanted to write a vampire story and a ghost story. That's my new novel that came out here in January in Spanish. It's Story of the Elements. It's like some sort of non-autobiographical story of my childhood and teenage years, understanding the idea of the past as the most real and gigantic ghosts of all,
Mm. Well, I love this section, and let's spend a moment a little more with the vampire. I like that you connect. I mean, it's an obvious connection, but I like that you draw forward Poe to Lovecraft, and you have this supernatural being accompanying Alan, Nico C., who, among other things, is meditating alongside Alan on his own nature. He isn't a vampire, he says. He doesn't need to feed on humans, even as beings like him, in his mind, they feed humans. That he's more like a phantasm plus a vampire, Vampiro, he calls himself. And him and his fellow creatures that haunt the human world are actually far happier to exist than we like to think. At one point in the novel, you write about how the dead take up far more space than the living, that their not being there is like being everywhere. And I thought about Nico like this, even though it doesn't seem like Alan Melville is being haunted here by someone close to him. I also thought about you, the author, and your biography when Nico C. says that his kind are not undead, nor are they dead who come back, but rather they are beings who undie. And it reminded me of one interview where I learned that you yourself were pronounced dead at birth.
Yeah.
And lastly, I thought about something.
Yes, doctor. Yes, doctor.
And lastly, I thought about something you wrote about Bolaño, that quote, one of his recurring ideas was his suspicion that he had died 10 years earlier in a hospital in Girona when he was diagnosed with a severe case of pancreatitis, and that everything that had happened to him in the last decade, children and wife and books, was just his final hallucination, the merciful prolongation of the last seconds of a dying man, which really sounds like a description of Alan Melville's hallucination here, that perhaps Nico C. was Melville's hallucination, or that Bolaño's suspicion was an influence on this section of the book. But either way, talk to us a little bit more about Nico C., and also whether you yourself, given your history at birth, are a vampiro.
Well, Nico C., first of all, is an Argentinian.
Yes.
The only character in the whole book that comes from Argentina. And I think it's because, it's what I told you, the idea of Argentina being like some sort of unbelievable, fantastic territory with pretty strange characters and people who usually die abroad. Borges died abroad, and Che Guevara died abroad. Carlos Gardel, the tango singer, died abroad. Evita's corpse, well, Evita died in Argentina, but her corpse traveled everywhere, I don't know if you know that story, but it's some sort of very dark myth of Argentine history about, Evita's involved body being traveling all over the world and being chased like some sort of holy relic, In all the fictions I like the best, I really like the presence or the idea of one character being wiser than all the rest and knowing more and having some sort of supernatural knowledge of the whole thing that it's happening. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I like to think it symbolizes the writer, maybe. You can be sort of lost while writing a book for a moment. But I agree with Nabokov, which is one of my favorite writers, when he used to say, I despise those writers that said, the characters take me where they want to go and I go after them, bullshit. You have to be in control. Huh. And so maybe it's some sort of superstitious thing or some sort of Kabbalistic movement of putting in there someone who knows everything in order to help me to know everything too.
Speaking of people dying abroad, I've visited Cortázar's grave in Paris. Did he die in France? Do you know?
He died in France. He wasn't born in Argentina. He was born in Belgium. He was technically not an Argentinian, which is a very Argentinian thing to be. I
love that. Well, my suggesting that you are possibly a vampiro, my tongue-in-cheek version of a real impulse of many readers to try to anchor their encounter of reading fiction within the real-life facts of the author. This is an impulse that you spend a good deal of time in the afterword interrogating. You do this at length, this impulse of some people to try to unearth real-life correspondences. You critique novels narrated by historical characters as superficial, even as we are reading a possible example of one. And you lament the trend of readers having more interest in the life of the author than actually reading the author, where everything has to have a reason to be real. And you say in no uncertain terms that the protagonist in your trilogy, called The Writer, is not a distorted version of you. But even though this approach to reading and understanding fiction that some of these readers do bothers you, you don't simply avoid writing historical characters within your fiction, because here we are with Alan and Herman Melville, and you yourself invite this mistake of reading, I think, by giving the writer in your trilogy many of the most basic details of your own life, while at the same time you have you as yourself make a cameo in the book to distinguish the two of you. So there is a push and pull that feels in a way like the inverse of what Philip Roth did in his book, The Facts.
Yeah.
Where for most of his career, his protagonists, they also shared the most basic details of his own life, so that readers often presumed, sometimes quite falsely, that the thoughts and events of Nathan Zuckerman or Alexander Portnoy were from Philip Roth's real life. Then, as a further provocation, he writes this book of nonfiction. It's a minor book of his, The Facts, that details just the bare facts of his childhood.
That book is a footnote to Zuckerman.
Yeah, and then his doppelganger or his avatar, Nathan Zuckerman, writes the epilogue and points out all the distortions and erasures and more in the so-called facts, where Roth's real life is being shown to also be a fiction, but shown this by his fictional character. So talk to us about this push and pull, where you seem to both invite the reader into something that you also want to push them away from. You spend a good deal of time at the end of this book lamenting certain habits of reading, and yet you sort of set traps for people to possibly read in that same way, to have a character like the writer, but also yourself in the same book. or Alan Melville, who really walked across the Hudson, but probably didn't walk across the Hudson with an Argentinian vampire.
Well, guilty as charged. With all that sort of thing, I have lots of theories and are some sort of intellectual, more or less brilliant alibis. But if I have to be completely sincere, I do it because it's fun. It's fun doing it. And it's part of what I read when I wanted to be a writer and I find very funny and saw the fun. It happened to me with Salinger's short stories and Kurt Vonnegut's books, and this idea of the author sort of reading over your shoulder what you are reading because it's what he wrote, but when you read it, it's part of you, and it's not anymore exactly what he wrote because you're putting in there all your personal things, You mentioned, that I was declared clinically dead at the moment of my birth, and they always ask me, it's like one of those classical topical questions to a writer is, when did you find out that you wanted to be a writer? And the truth is, I've always known since the beginning. I don't have some sort of epiphanic moment or a book I read and I said, I want to do this. And my mother just told me that thing that I was born dead when I was like 21, 22. She never spoke about it. And then I said to myself, maybe it was right there and then when I decided to be a writer, because, I knew how it's going to end. I started for the end part, and I lived to tell the tale.
Yeah. You really did.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask that question in a different way.
Okay.
Because I believe, and it is fun as a reader. These games are fun, and I can tell you're having fun, but there's a seriousness too, because I can't believe that you would write the afterword and spend so much time on a lengthy afterword talking about this reading habit, which feels like there's a distress there. Maybe you could spend a moment with the impulse to write that afterward, to write about the wrong sorts of questions to ask when you're reading, or the wrong sorts of questions to ask when people are reading you.
Yeah. Well, all my books have very, very long afterwards, and they're often criticized for that. I really love writing them. In fact, there's a good friend of mine, Alan Pauls, which is an amazing Argentinian writer, who says that my last book, just before I died, should be all my afterwards put together with a last afterword about the afterwards,
And maybe some footnotes for good measure.
Of course, many footnotes. Well, the trilogy was written during now it's sort of stopping. I think it was like that in the United States also. Here there was a moment with the autofiction and everyone telling in strictly real terms about themselves. And I think that was the product of a very bad influence. It was social media. It was like people sort of starting telling themselves on social media and said, okay, this could be a book. There was this classical situation for a writer when you go to a party and a guy comes to, or a woman comes to you and says, oh, my life could be a great novel, and they start telling it to you for you to write the book. That doesn't happen anymore. Now they come with a manuscript.
Wow.
They already have all their life,
Yeah.
And it was some sort of rage against the dying of the light in terms of pure fiction, imaginative fiction, and tell stories and not telling supposedly realities which are not real. And I think it's much more interesting in any writer, to find out in their fictions that the autobiographical things, as you pointed out, sort of, hidden or in a subliminal way than you telling the truth all the time or trying to tell the truth, There's one thing that it makes me laugh and it makes me cry at the same time, is when you read when you go into Amazon and read the comments of the readers, one of the most frequent criticizing, quote unquote, it's people saying, I couldn't relate to any character, which is completely absurd to me, because you read fiction not to be related. You read fiction to know completely different people than you. And knowing them, they become part of your life and your experience. But if you're going to read fiction looking for someone that looks like you, acts like you, and says the same things, we're in deep shit, man.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. It reminds me a little bit, just to go back to Roth for another second, is that his whole career sort of was predicated on this reading mistake when he wrote Portnoy's Complaint, and everyone assumed his parents were like the parents in that book and that he was like Portnoy. And apparently his parents are nothing like the parents in that book. And instead of clarifying that, he decides just to add more inconsequential details of his own life into his characters, but then having them do entirely different things and think different thoughts than he actually thinks. But it didn't it made the problem worse, because near the end, I mean, his whole career are all of these masks. But by the end of his career with a character who I think had like prostate surgery and has incontinence and can't leave his house, and everyone is still assuming that's Philip Roth's situation.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, it's one of the things that the third part of Melvill sort of talks about when Melvill is clearly worried, tormented, and suffering the possibility of having become a character of himself, not a person anymore, you know?
So I love this line from Melville. Reality only becomes really real after crossing the stormy sea of art and arriving safe and sound to the other shore. Not while we live it or write it, but later when we read it. And only then does everything become logical and inevitable, and we ask ourselves how we failed to see it or see it coming. Thus, everything that one invents ends up or starts out being true, and taking place ends up having taken place to hereby begin to take place. And this makes me think of the manner in which you retell your own life in your nonfiction, whether it's essays or in interviews. For instance, in talking about your own childhood, your home, a place where dissidents would sometimes hide out, your parents being jailed, and how when you were briefly kidnapped by people looking for your parents, you said this was the first time you felt like you had a personal experience worthy of being fictionalized. And that quote, "For me, that is the greatest honor you can bestow on reality, to turn it into fiction." And perhaps similarly, what you call the great milestone of your literary formation was actually a real fiction. Your father and you relocate to Venezuela. You're expelled from school, but you don't tell your father. Instead, you pretend you were going to class every day for 2 years. And it was during that time you went to the library instead. Also, when you were starting out as a writer, you wrote for a credit card magazine called Diners, but under 9 different pseudonyms. Or your piece in The Believer about your friendship with Bolaño again, where you're meeting at a Kentucky Fried Chicken in Spain during the time he's doing research for 2666, where one passage you write goes, "We leave the Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Bolaño goes down the stairs to the platform of his commuter train, and I return home. And a half an hour later, Bolaño rings my doorbell again. He's soaked by the storm and wild-eyed and shaking as if barely withstanding a private earthquake. I've killed a man," he announces in a deathly voice, and he comes into my apartment, heads for the living room, and asks me to make him a cup of tea. Then he tells me, as he was waiting on the platform, a couple of skinheads had come up to him and tried to rob him, that there was a scuffle, that he managed to get a knife away from one of them and stabbed the other one near the heart, that then he ran away down the corridors and streets, and that he didn't know what to do next. What should I do? Should I turn myself in? And as we read further, we discover he's made all of this up. And not only has he made it all up, he's amazed that you've believed it. And you say to us, and only now do I understand that on that afternoon, without realizing it, I was enjoying the rare privilege of seeing Bolaño writing, and writing himself, reading aloud, and rarest and most precious phenomenon of all, seeing myself inside one of his stories. One of those stories where Bolaño was and is, and luckily always will be, a Bolaño character. But to make this more absurdly meta and labyrinthine, you yourself do actually appear in his books as yourself. Yep. For instance, in 2666, you show up in Kensington Gardens taking notes for your novel, Kensington Gardens. And lastly, I want to mention your wonderful piece called Borges and Me, about your two random encounters with Borges. One which, I don't know if these are true. I mean, part of me is like, it was just kind of wonderful, but one which is entirely improbable, as if it were a novel or a fiction, is you walking your blind uncle on your arm, and from the other direction, Borges is approaching in a similar fashion. And when you yell Borges, they both look at each other for a moment unseen. And the other is during a fight you're having on the street with a girlfriend of yours, and you are running after her, and in doing so, you run over Borges on the street. You knock him over on his back, and you wonder whether you've killed him. And you say, who knew if this collision with great literature would be the trigger of other stories, or the Fukuyama-esque end of my history as a writer? Because what would be the point of writing anything if I went down in history as the person who killed Borges? All of these stories, I think, these nonfictions or supposed nonfictions, help me to fully understand these lines from Melville. Supreme reality and absolute fictions are always seen as rivals, but actually are moved by complementary ambitions. I was hoping maybe you could spend a moment on that, or on anything else that this epic maximalist question sparks in your brain.
Yeah. Well, it's a very paradoxical thing, because all those stories you told, that I told, the Bolaño one and the two with Borges, are completely true. But here's the catch. If I want to remember exactly how they were, I have to read the versions I wrote, because, I mean, the things I wrote are much more stronger to me and much more real than the actual fact. And it sometimes happens that to you, that when you writing something real, the real things starts like to fade, and the written version takes command. And that is going to be the real thing, But I have the distinct memory of, well, of course, I almost killed Borges, going after my girlfriend, and I have witnesses, and I remember that sort of thing with my blind uncle and Borges, and my wife was at home when Bolaño came and do that some sort of perfect Bolaño short story to be told by Rodrigo Fresán. But I really like that. I think there's some sort of not exactly poetic justice, but literary justice in the idea of the written version being the real version at last.
Mm-hmm.
At the end.
I'll definitely point people to these essays of yours, because they're really amazing. And I do think they add some sort of, it's like an inverse, they add depth to reading your fiction to read the fictional nature of your nonfiction, because they're true, but they're hard to believe, the nonfictions. It's sort of in a reverse of reading Melville.
When my publisher in Spain, who was Claudio López La Madrid, who died like, I don't know, 2019 already. He always wanted me to write, and maybe I'm going to do it one day, but I'm sort of superstitious. He wanted me to write a book about all my encounters with famous people, which are completely absurd stories, and probably unbelievable. But I have witnesses for all of them. So I don't have any trouble with that. I mean, with Susan Sontag, Hugh Grant, there are lots of very strange.
I really want to read that.
Yeah. And probably it's going to be the book that if I publish it, it's going to be the bestseller of my life. It's going to be the one that to sell the most.
I think it will be.
I'm not comfortable with the idea of these anecdotes that I tell my friends to tell them to everybody. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't think that the life of a writer, the private life, has to be like so public in a way.
No. Those books that people are burying for 100 years in Norway?
Yeah.
Yeah, you should write the book and then it can come out 100 years after you're gone.
But then I'll never know if it's going to be a bestseller or not.
That's a good point.
Yeah. I don't know. It always comes to the same thing. You were saying it. I mean, all my books, for me, that when they ask me, which is another pretty uncomfortable moment at parties, when you said you're a writer, and they say, what kind of writing you do? And you said fiction. And some people say science fiction because it sounds fiction. They automatically think that fiction is science fiction. And say no. And say, but what are your books are about? And said, I think that they all deal with the most transgressive theme that we have today, that is reading and writing. I mean, that's the most subversive theme you can invoke these days. Mm.
Well, to stay with the afterword for another moment, it's here that we learn not only just how much research you've done on Herman Melville, but also how much of the book is ultimately a departure from research. In the book itself, we learn about Melville's ancestry, that he comes from legends of the Revolution and high colonial society, that his grandfather fought in the Tea Party uprisings and was appointed Inspector of Customs by George Washington, that back in Scotland his ancestors were nobility, and that he was also related to the first woman Scottish writer, among many other writers and artists in his family tree. But whereas these details, as well as places and dates, are real, many of the actions and thoughts are not only fully invented, but sometimes they are even your own thoughts being spoken or thought by this real historical figure. So touch upon the importance of research for you. Why do you do research, and how and when does research stop and get left behind? Because we have this strange juxtaposition, obviously. What's the impulse to do the research in the first place, to abandon the research?
Well, I think that research in a way is like gasoline in a car. You have to fill up the tank, and when it's filled up, you'll have gasoline enough to go where you want to go. And you don't necessarily use it, but it sort of impregnates everything, and there's like some sort of aroma or perfume that really, really helps you, to be in a place or in a time, John Banville, who's a very good friend of mine, he told me that he wrote these novels about Copernicus and Kepler, and he started researching a lot. And there was a moment when he discovered he had to invent. I think that you research in order to feel, quote unquote, guilty for inventing later.
Well, when talking about supreme reality versus absolute fictions, at one point you say, and from that dynamic friction came the electric ghost of the ones howling in the bones of the others' faces, which is a reworking of a famous line from Dylan's Visions of Johanna.
Yeah, it's in every book of mine.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you about. I really like discovering Dylan's attributed and unattributed presences in your work, but particularly the marginalia, whether referencing his song Series of Dreams, or in the new book, this book, an epigraph from his most recent album, a song, Key West, perhaps the most maximalist song on the album. For the first 30, 5-ish years of my life on the planet, I definitely nerded out on Dylan marginalia, going to these weird traveling trade shows at empty shopping malls in the 90s to find illegal bootlegs before before he started releasing them officially. And also to find even weirder things, like a book in the 70s that examines his album Planet Waves, but it looks at it through a Jewish mystical lens, as if the album is a Kabbalistic album. Each of the 10 songs represents one of the Sephirot in the Kabbalistic tree of life. And it has all these crazy diagrams and illustrations alongside a parsing of the lyrics of each of the songs. You in this book mention his Moby Dick inspired song, Bob Dylan's 115th Dream, which I think a lot of people probably know, his bootleg album, Great White Wonder, his Nobel speech, which speaks directly to Moby Dick. But I would imagine more broadly, one reason you might be attracted to him is the very things we've been discussing, the ways he plays with the fiction that is Bob Dylan. He's his mercurial, ever-shifting nature, the ways he continues to sort of turn away from one audience and then create a new audience, the various masks he's worn, most explicitly in the Ronaldo and Clara era, but really his whole career. But tell us in your own words why Bob Dylan is in many of your books, and also if he's more than a reference and a love, if he's also an influence in some way. And if he is an influence, how is he an influence?
Well, Dylan, to me, it's a mystery. And if you're a writer, you can resist the idea of a mystery, especially in a world and in an age of not a lot of real mysteries around, and he was a mystery since the beginning. And in terms of Melvillian way of looking at it, I mean, he's part Ahab, part Ishmael, part Moby Dick. I mean, he's all over the place, and he's so concentrated at the same time. And in fact, well, I have two very freak encounters with Bob Dylan that maybe they'll be part of the. I mean, I told them in the Invented Park. I think that they are, and they're completely real. About Bob Dylan in his underwear at his room, washing his blue jeans at his hotel room. But I really like his voice. I think that his voice is his style. Famously, you not know that Frank Sinatra used to say that he was one of the greatest technical singers of all time. Huh. And Sinatra said that he couldn't understand people saying that Dylan doesn't sing well. And he's saying he's a much more good singer than myself. Mm. And he was Frank Sinatra, And I really like his phrasing and his sort of long and winding roads of verses. And that verse from that line, from Visions of Johanna, for me, it's amazing. And I put him all over my books. There's always a cameo of that, as there's always a cameo of this sort of one of my favorite quotes by Kurt Vonnegut in Slaughterhouse-Five, when he describes the books of the Trafalmadorians, And I think that that's the sort of books I want to write. I want to write Trafalmadorians books where all things happen at the same time, and there are some sort of wonderful moments in time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Bob Dylan, for me, it's like a test. If I meet someone and I ask him, do you like Bob Dylan? And the person says, I hate him. Okay. See you later. Never again,
You've said that you're happy to have departed from journalism and interviewing, and you've interviewed so many big writers, but you said you would still like to interview Dylan. Is this something you've pursued or want to pursue?
You can pursue it. They have to pursue you. I mean, they have to say you've been chosen. You have to be at this time at this place. Jonathan Lethem told me that he interviewed him. Yes. And it was like some sort of very secret operation. They give you like the basic facts in order to get there, But I think maybe it'll be no good to know him, you know?
I agree. Like, well, first of all, I really like Jonathan Letham's interview of him. But it's like some people have asked me, like, would you want to interview Bob Dylan? Or like when they do in the New York Times this section called By the Book, and they ask people, they ask famous writers, what would be your ideal dinner party? And you pick 3 people. I don't think I would want to have Dylan because I want the distance. Something about admiring him at a distance feels important to me versus being at the table with him.
Yeah, and in fact, he's like some sort of Moby Dick.
Yeah.
You better not get close. You better not get too close to him. Yeah. You know, Patti Smith, when she came to Roberto Bolaño's festival, she was invited. We had lunch with her at Ignacio Echeverria's house, who was the editor of Bolaño at the time. And of course, I sort of started asking her about Bob Dylan, trying to know. And she told me he's a cipher, you know. I mean, I can tell you lots of things, but they all amount to nothing. And she's Patti Smith, you know, she has some sort of proximity. I really like reading in the last biographies of him that he's perfectly happy playing with the grandchildren. I really like that. I think that's good. Hopeful.
Yeah. Well, we have a question for you from another about style. But before we hear this question from someone else, I wanted to ask you about the question of style more generally. In one footnote in Melvill, Herman talks about how the new word imposes a new time and how he hopes it will lead to a new style. And then much later in Melvill, there is talk of a book, a pure style of book, a book of pure style, where many things would end so many other things could begin. And you yourself talk outside your books about a conversation you had with John Banville, where you ask him which is more important, style or plot. And he answers, style goes on ahead, giving triumphal leaps, while the plot follows along behind, dragging its feet. So it seems quite clear, if I ask you this same question that you asked Banville, which is important, style or plot, that you too will pick style. But talk to us about style versus plot.
When I had that conversation with John, with Banville, and he gave me that answer, I said to him, well, but maybe style can look over his shoulder and see plot getting behind, and maybe he can come back to plot in its arms, and they can walk together. And Banville said to me, okay, but that's perfection. That's the very difficult, really difficult thing to achieve, you know. But I think style is the finishing line, especially now. There are more and more narrators, but not writers. I mean, people narrate basically now in books or in movies, you know. And I think that style is the place where you have to arrive, you know. I think that when you read, there are like different stages when you start reading, that it's some sort of like a video game sort of thing. But I think it applies also for a writer. I think when you start reading, the first impulse when you're a kid is you identify with the protagonist, with the hero or the anti-hero or the bad guy, whatever. If you keep on reading, you are sort of marveled to the idea of those characters having many books. For example, I remember when I read The Three Musketeers, and then after that I discovered that there were more books with D'Artagnan. I couldn't believe it. I was so happy. And same with Can by Emilio Salgari, you know, that there was this idea of whole fictional universe being constructed like history, like reality. And if you keep on reading with a much more specialized eye, then you begin to feel certain curiosity about the writer, about the author, about who wrote that, how he did it, how was his life, whatever. And then there's the last stage that you don't have to arrive if you're just a reader who wants to have a great time or be sort of distracted. reading a book. And that's style. When you read something and you say, this has some very different style to this, and this is really very strange compared to the things I've been reading up until now, And that's really intriguing, the idea of, you read kids' books, you read newspapers, and then you read something that could have been written just by one person and not anyone more. And that's sort of strange, the idea of it has some sort of witch doctor shamanistic sort of thing, that all wise man of the tribe, whatever, no? Someone has given himself the authority of tell something in a very unique way. And then you have Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Kafka, Nabokov, Proust, all the big ones.
Yeah.
It gets even much more astonishing and strange when you think, okay, Ulysses by James Joyce is one day in the life of a guy. That's all. Mrs. Dalloway is one afternoon in the life of a woman. The thing that surrounds style, it's a pretty simple story. Moby Dick, same thing. Let's go after a whale, man.
Yeah. And your latest book, this really brief period within the father of a famous author.
Yeah.
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 So in the spirit of your referential and self-referential texts, we have a question for you from Will van der Heyden, the translator of your work.
The author.
The author of your latest book in English. Will has received NEA and Lannan fellowships, and his translation of your book, The Invented Part, won the 2018 Best Translated Book Award. And I'm interviewing Will as well about translating you and about translating Melvill in particular, which will be available for supporters of the show who subscribe to the bonus audio.
I really like that. It's like some sort of bonus track.
Yeah, no, it is. And there's a lot of long-form conversations with great translators. The Spanish language translators include Sophie Hughes talking about Fernanda Melchor, Megan McDowell talking about Alejandro Zambra and Mariana Enriquez in 2 separate interviews. And also Sarah Booker and Suzanne Jill Levine, both talking about different books of Cristina Rivera Garza. But here's a question.
So Suzanne Jill Levine, she wrote Manuel Puig's biography, right?
It's possible.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So here's a question for you from Will.
Hi, Rodrigo. Even though you and I are in touch pretty regularly, I'm still very grateful for and humbled by the opportunity to ask you a question in this space. As you know, I've been working on a translation of Mantra, a novel of yours that was originally published in Spanish back in 2000. And I've also recently translated stories of yours from your first book, Historia Argentina, and your second book, Vidas de Santos. Translating fiction from earlier in your career has got me thinking about the ways in which your style has and hasn't changed over the years. To me, there's an unmistakable sensibility that's always characterized your work, and certain tendencies and impulses and stylistic tics remain consistent throughout. But I wonder, looking back, how do you think your style has changed or evolved? Are there moments, books, stories, paragraphs, lines that mark a shift for you? I have this uninterrogated sense that something culminated in Mantra, that your style kind of broke open with and in the wake of that book. Do you think there's anything to that? Is there a before and after to Mantra for you? And either way, how has your style evolved or changed since then? And is this an impossible question to ask a writer of his or her own work? Or do you have some insight? Thanks.
I think Will knows me better than myself, because what he asks about Mantra, it's true. Everything changed there in a way, but it changed because Mantra was part of a collection of an imprint of, I think it was 6, 7, or 8 books. There was one by Roberto Bolaño there, where my publisher decided on the brink of millennium to put out some sort of imprint about 6, 7, or 8 big cities and you have to write something about them. And I would have chosen London or New York, but he said, no way, because it's going to be very easy for you, and I don't want an easy book. So he gave me Mexico, which I would have never have chosen, but I'm married to a Mexican. And that was the reason for Claudio to say, you have to take Mexico. And I had a great time because I discovered that Mexico was very important to me. I mean, all the comic books came from Mexico. All the TV series were like dubbed in Mexico. I really loved, the mummies of Guanajuato thing and the masked fighters and all that sort of thing. And I really was obsessed when I was a kid by Aztecs and Mayans and all the pre-Columbian culture. But the thing was that I was like a writer for hire, and they gave me this mission. I mean, when you accept something like that, you have two choices, I think. One is to say, okay, I'm going to do it very fast. I'm going to read the contract, going to sign it, going to get the money and run, and I'm going to do it okay, but it's going to be like some sort of book I'm going to disown eventually, and it's going to be one of those things that one does for money. And the other way of doing it is saying, okay, I'm going to do everything I'm afraid to do in my books here with the alibi that I was like paid for doing it. So I'm going to take all the risks. I'm going to do all the things. I don't think they're going to work out good. Things that I've never dared to do in one of my books because fear of failure. And it worked out, and it was amazing. And I did lots of things that I did after Mantra in all the books that came before it. And I was able to do that because I had some sort of backstage pass, carte blanche, get out of jail card in a way. And then, of course, there are like some huge reading experiences that sort of form of or deformed, I told you about Dracula when I was a kid. That was one amazing thing. I mean, when I discovered, I really was like a fan of horror movies and Dracula movies, and then I was going to read the novel. And it really astonished me, the idea that the complete, not abridged version of Dracula that I read, it was like 400, 500 pages. In there, Dracula only shows up in 30 pages. And I found that
wow.
In the movies, it's different. He's all over the place all the time. But in the book, everyone is talking, writing, and thinking and being obsessed by the absence of Dracula. Dracula is at the beginning. There are some moments in the middle and at the end when he dies. Mm. And it was like the first time that I was like an 8-year-old reader that wanted to be a writer. And I was already writing as an 8-year-old boy. I thought for the first time as a writer, saying, this works like this. And then I read when I was 35, after many, many tries that they didn't work out. I finally did it. I went to a hotel for 15 days, 2 weeks, with the whole set of Proust, In Search of Lost Time. And basically I did that. And I came transfigured after that. It changed when I read Pale Fire, but Nabokov, the same thing,
Yeah.
Do I answer Will's question with this?
Well, in a way, it's kind of the perfect answer, because you talked about your change in style through what you read, which was what we talked about at the beginning, like the figure of the reader more than the figure of the writer.
Yeah, but at the same time, I consider myself very, very, very lucky, because when they have to reissue and I have to read proofs again of my first book, Historia Argentina, I'm already totally there. I don't have to deny that book as many writers do with their first, second, or even third, the first 3 books.
Yeah,
it's all in there.
That's
already.
Great. Well, given that style is most often associated with voice, and often considered rightly or wrongly like a fingerprint, something intimately connected to the particulars of a person, I wanted to talk about both point of view and names and naming. And I'm going to pair my question with a question from another person also. In other words, I'm going to twin two points of view on the question of point of view. You don't only play with point of view, but it also is an actual topic of meditation in this book. While Alan is walking across the ice with his vampiro, there's the question of the frozen third person versus the warm first person. And the remove of the third person is seen as a way to be a good character despite one's bad actions. This raises questions of voice in relation to identity, which you further complicate with lines like, "My father is a whale and I am his Jonah." But there are two places that leapt out to me as possible ways to understand your relationship to Melvill and also Melville's relationship to his father. You don't explicitly connect them this way, so this might actually be a stretch, but you describe wind at one point as that which, quote, has the shape of everything that it moves and through which it blows. Pine boughs, owl feather, and how many years has that hat been there suspended in the air? And then another line that seems similar where you say, "And then my father squats down beside me and puts his hands on my shoulders and looks me in the eyes with his eyes full of tears." But then there's this parenthetical, really, it's his tears that are full of his eyes. Both of these lines, I think, by inverting point of view, whether tears full of eyes or wind defined by everything that it blows against, they feel like they're flirting with something mysterious, but also possibly true about identity. So my part of this question is to ask you to talk to us about why considerations of point of view become part of the plot of this book. And the second part of this question, to elongate this to maybe even mimic one of your maximalist footnotes, the second part of the question is from Rebecca Hussey, a board member of the National Book Critics Circle Award and a judge for their translation prize. And she's also the co-host of a great literary podcast called One Bright Book. So here's part two of the question on voice and point of view from Rebecca.
Hello, David and Rodrigo. Thank you so much for inviting me to ask a question, David. One of the great pleasures of being able to do this is having the opportunity to go back and think further about Melville, a novel that I enjoyed very much. It's a book that rewards deeper and deeper thought. So my question, Rodrigo, is about voice. I'm curious how you think about the relationship of the voice or voices in the various sections of the novel and how they relate to each other. You have the third-person narration of Alan Melville's life, accompanied by Herman Melville's footnotes. And then we have Alan's narration of his own story, which is told in the first and the third person. And then we have what happens with the footnotes and the main text at the beginning of the last section. So it seems to me that it's possible to read the book as being about the slow emergence of a relatively stable voice that we find in that last section. It's a story about how Herman Melville became the author that he is. But also, looking at the book as a whole, what stands out to me is the multi-voiced nature of the storytelling. So I'm wondering, how did you think about the novel's different voices and how they fit together or don't, how they relate to each other or don't? So thank you very much.
Well, I think the book it's an education. It's the story of an education or a miseducation, whatever you want to think about it. Think about the voices, the technical things of the book. As I just told you, when I felt that Dracula was something special because Dracula was not there when I read the book, I really like the idea of readers thinking about that sort of thing. But me as a writer, more of it is I'm not going to say instinct because it won't be true, but I think it's the accumulation of all you read and all you wrote. I mean, that there's some sort of sediment there, some sort of thing underground. In fact, there's one of my favorite moments in Moby Dick. I think I mentioned it in the book. Is that chapter? It's called The Fountain. The fountain is, the geyser of the well that comes out. And there are like 3 lines in there that where suddenly Melville shows up and says, I'm at my desk right now, and this is the day, and this is the hour, and I'm here. And goes into the book and then goes out, and you never saw him again, And I like to think of myself when I'm writing a little bit like that, going in and out, but don't want it to be too involved. I don't want to interfere. I'm in control, of course. I think lots of things, but at the same time, I think that there are like 2 kinds of readers dash writers, writers dash readers. You can compare them to one who goes to see a magician. There's the sort of audience that goes to see a magician, and it's trying really hard to discover how he did it. All the time is thinking, like watching him to see if you see some string of some hidden trapdoor. In a way, they don't want to be lied to. They want to know the truth, and they don't give a damn about the illusion. And there's the other kind of audience that goes to a magician that just wants to be like, okay, thrill me. I don't want to know how you do it. I just want to enjoy. And in that sense, when I'm writing, I'm trying to be like a reader in a way, a reader of myself, of what I write, of course. Of course, I can talk a lot about how The Boys goes. There were some people that read Melville and told me, I don't know, it's amazing how you manage to mimic Melville's tone in the whole book. Never tried to do that. Never. First of all, because I'm not worthy. I'm not going to try to channel the ghost of Herman Melville and make him speak through my fingers and my brains and my keyboard. I think that in her question is the real answer. I mean, she says in a way completely clearly, in a theoretical way, what I clearly see in a practical way. And thanks a lot to her, because I heard what she found out from her lips, and now I understand completely the book I wrote, in a way.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, there's also the theme of the importance of names in the book. In one footnote, Herman says, I've said this before, it's been known since Homer, names and numbers and origins of men and women are as important and defining for me as the names of ships, like those of all the symbolic ships that will pass through the symbolic ship of my novel, Albatross, Rosebud, Bachelor, Delight. The names are what always tells the story. And there's some focus, starting with the cover of the book until the end of the novel, on the mysterious E that is added to Herman's name that does not exist for his father's. I wonder if this is like Robert Zimmerman becoming Bob Dylan, or, as you mentioned in the afterword, William Faulkner, who also added a letter to his name, a U. And I went and looked it up, and in his case, it's to distinguish himself from his father, a way to invent a self. But there are other theories that predominate, maybe more mundane and banal theories about why this E ends up in Herman's name and not in Alan's. But talk to us about the E, the haunting of the E.
Yeah. Well, the main theory, and it seems it's the right one, that Alan Melville's widow wanted to sort of escape all the people that Alan Melville owed money to, adding that E to the last name in order to sort of give to her sons some sort of clear state in order for them to keep on living, starting again. The funny thing is that everyone wrote Melville with an E. I mean, all the checks and all the documents and all the things Alan Melville signed to his creditors were with an E, But of course, that there's that possibility also of the idea of some sort of renewal and starting again. But it's all a mystery, because I don't remember that Melville ever wrote a word about his father. It was like some sort of very shining black hole, in a way, you know. And he was looking all the time like not paternal figures, but sort of elders that happened with Nathaniel Hawthorne, his relationship with him, you know, and he was all the time like looking for people who can protect him in a way.
Well, I'm curious also about what seems like a longstanding interest in the 3-part structure, not just the invented part, the dreamed part, and the remembered part trilogy, but your book Bottom of the Sky is divided into this planet, the space between this planet and the other planet, and the other planet. In this book, it's 3 parts named The Father of the Sun, Glaciology or the Transparency of Ice, and The Son of the Father. It's not a coincidence, I don't think, that we keep ending up here.
No, and I thought a lot about it. And I finally discovered or want to believe that it was like some sort of very strong radiation I suffered as a kid when I listened for the first time to A Day in the Life by the Beatles. There's a 3-part song, and it's the last song on Sgt. Pepper's. And I remember distinctly my father coming home with the brand new record, and me seeing all that sort of people on the cover and feeling very intrigued about who they were. And I think that from there comes also some sort of manic referential thing that I have, you know, in all my books. And the other thing is 2001 Space Odyssey, which is also a 3-part movie. It's like prehistoric times, the sort of present, and then that part beyond the universe and coming back to Earth. And well, just the Holy Trinity. I'm not a believer, but also, you know, there are like some religious maybe thing there. But when I'm writing a book, I find very comforting and makes me feel secure the idea that I'm writing a thing in 3 parts and I can jump from one to another. I don't write my books linearly. I don't go from beginning to end. So I have like these 3 different playgrounds where I can jump from one to another.
Well, you may have answered the next question I'm going to ask, but let me ask it and see. As we approach the end and thinking of the last section, the Son of the Father, where unlike the first, where the Son is footnoting the Father, the footnotes grow until they become the main text, almost as if Jonah were swallowing the whale, which reminds me of Borges' notion of the infinite novel and his notion of Moby Dick as an infinite novel, which also reminds me of this passage in your book, The Dreamed Part, where the writer describes the book that might be in our hands as follows: a book with all times at the same time, which, when seen all at once, produce an image of life that's beautiful and surprising and deep. There's no beginning, no middle, no end, no suspense, no moral, no cause, no effect. Nothing but marvelous moments where invention is the control, dreams the entropy, and memory somewhere in between, somnambulant and ambulating through what's created while awake and what's thought while asleep. Or how Bolaño says the only protagonist of his work, the authentic heroine of his books, is literature itself. Or Herman in your book describing the book he wants to write, which sounds like a book that swallows the world, when he says, a voyage that captures the whole universe, that is both species and genus, that would contain its own commentary and invent its own rules, that would avail itself of everything already on offer and anticipate everything yet to come, a going forward in reverse. Or later when Herman reads a future biography of himself. And that's one of the fun things about this book, is all these things that come to the characters from the future, postcards, books. But at one point, Herman reads a future biography of himself, and he says, the great crime and unforgivable sin of novels is that of convincing us that our lives have a logic and an order that doesn't exist. Lives are really books of stories. And that makes me think of your wonderfully bonkers acknowledgement section where you thank everyone from Cesar Ira to Dante to David Lynch to Huysmans to Pink Floyd to Stephen King and on and on and on and on. It's immense.
Yeah, but they're all justified. They're something.
I'm
really.
Sure. And there's probably a book of justifications that corresponds to each name.
Yeah. Well, Cesar Ira has a very interesting theory about Moby Dick, that he says that "call me Ishmael," the first line of Moby Dick.
Yeah.
In fact, what he's telling you is, you can call me Ishmael, but it's not my real name.
Yeah, I love that.
Because when you think about, 19th century conventions, no one says, call me Ishmael at the beginning of the novel. They said, my name is Ishmael.
Right. So all of this that I've just read are symptoms of what you yourself call, and what you just did in the last answer, which you call referential mania. And that phrase itself is referential. It goes back to Nabokov's short story, Signs and Symbols, where he coins this term to refer to a rare mental illness that causes someone to believe everything around them is a coded reference to their existence.
Yeah.
You share this malady of maximal referentiality with Borges, with Bolaño, perhaps even with me with these crazy questions. And I wondered if you also share this quest of Bolaño's and your framing of it, that he sought to achieve the total oeuvre, to search for and discover the hidden center or secret of the world. A journey that seems to somehow involve constellating everyone else as part of it, just like your acknowledgement seems to name all of these people who are you and have made you.
Well, you mentioned, you quote that phrase with, as I told you before, is that part of Slaughterhouse-Five. I took it and ran with it and took it with me to where I wanted to go, And yes, I'm a maniac referential, and I really like to play. And Roberto's, I think what Roberto said, I mean, the deepest, not secret, but sacred aspiration, if to achieve something like that. But at the same time, Roberto used to say that all writers who think about posterity should know that in a couple of million years, our planet is going to disappear and Shakespeare will be gone forever, So I think that you have to work in the darkness and the restless madness of art, as Henry James used to say, with ambition, but at the same time, being completely humble and knowing that your place in the stars is so small in a way. And I really like to sort of refer to that in the final pages of Melvill. That is also what Fitzgerald does at the end of The Great Gatsby, when he parks the plot and the story away and goes into some sort of cosmic vision of the idea of nation and America and the future and the past and whatever. No, the last word in Melvill, I mean, in Spanish, it's impossible to translate it. It's like some sort of wordplay, because it says, Melville finishes with some sort of biblical invocation of God and saying, and his last word when everything finishes will be sí. But in Spanish, you read it like sea. And sea at the same time is, the ocean is the action of looking, of seeing. And sea in Spanish is so be it, It's over. So if you read it in Spanish, it plays the three ways at the same time,
I love that it has more resonances in Spanish somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah. You sometimes quote a line of Nabokov's that I also love, that goes like this: literature is invention. Fiction is fiction. To call a story a true story is an insult to both art and truth. Every great writer is a great deceiver, but so is that arch cheat, nature. Nature always deceives, from the simple deception of propagation to the prodigiously sophisticated illusion of protective colors in butterflies or birds. There is in nature a marvelous system of spells and wiles, The writer of fiction only follows nature's lead. Then, with a pleasure which is both sensual and intellectual, we shall watch the artist build his castle of cards, and watch the castle of cards become a castle of beautiful steel and glass. So in that spirit, talk to us about what we can expect from you next. What castle of cards you are constructing for us now?
Well, first of all, Vladimir Nabokov gets better and better with each day that passes, and that's great. I mean, that's immortality, really. That's posterity. He also said that, reality is overvalued. And he said that the word reality has always had to be written between brackets, because it's absurd to say reality. And I really admire of Nabokov and sort of makes me even admire him even more is that he never played the victim card as a writer. He played that he would have gotten the Nobel Prize like this. He had like a very strange, not exactly tragic, but very convulsed life, and he was always happy in a way. And I really like the idea of happy writers. I hope I'm a happy writer and not a tragic one, completely tormented by the state of things and storm and lightning and heavy rains, and saying I have to be witness to all of this in order to be of some utility to society. I don't give a shit about that. I mean, I think that's not the role of a writer. Basically, I'll keep on having fun. And there's this huge book that, as I told you, it's already published in Spain and in Latin America. It's called El Estilo de los Elementos, the style of the elements, playing with the idea of the elements of style, that famous writing that he has already been bought by Open Letter, and it's going to be translated by Will.
Great.
After Mantra. And I just finished a small essay for an imprint that publishes small books, because next year in April is going to be like the 100 years of The Great Gatsby. And I wrote an essay about The Great Gatsby, how it was written, what it means to me. And it's a very small book, and it's called, of course, The Little Gatsby.
I look forward to that. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rodrigo, for being on the show today.
It was a pleasure, and I want to thank you for all the magnificent, disturbing questions you asked, you and your guests. I don't know if I'm going to be able to sleep tonight, because I'll be like in bed in the dark saying, oh God, what have I done? What do they think about me? All those theories, all those things. But it really was really, really, really amazing. It was a real pleasure. And if you were a shrink, I'll be back for a second session.
All right. I love it. I'll get you on the couch.
Okay.
We've been talking today to Rodrigo Fresán, the author most recently of Melvill from Open Letter Books. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider joining the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter and help keep this quixotic endeavor going into the future. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives supplementary resources with each and every conversation of things I discovered while preparing, things referenced during the conversation, and places to explore once you're done listening. Additionally, there are a variety of other potential gifts and rewards, including the bonus audio archive, which includes long-form conversations with translators from Emma Ramadan and Megan McDowell to Ellen Elias Bursich to today's bonus conversation with Will Vanderheiden. It includes writers from Arthur Z to Phil Metras sharing their own translations from the Chinese and Russian respectively in these cases, and much more. There's also the Tin House Early Readership subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public, rare collectibles from past guests, and a bundle of books selected and curated by me and sent to you. You can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers, or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Beth Steidel in the art department, Becky Kramer and Isabel Lemus Christensen in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the Summer and Winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank past Between the Covers guest, poet, musician, composer, performer, and much more, Alicia Jo Rabins, for making the intro and the outro for the show. You can find out more about her work, her writing, her music, her film at aliciajo.com, ALICIAJO.com.